It's good to see you today. I hope you had a good weekend and a good Lord's Day, the first day of the week yesterday. This week we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We are going to be looking at verses 2 through 16. If you're following along in your Bible, as usual, I'll have it up on the screen. There it is, and let's just read a little bit. Verse 2. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I handed them down. And let me switch it over to New King James just because I'm more familiar with it. Verse 3 now. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man, nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Frankly, I'll be honest with you, not that I have not been honest with you all along. I have not been looking forward to this passage, because this passage is somewhat of a sensitive topic for a lot of people. And so haven't been looking forward to it a whole lot, but nonetheless, it did help me, and hopefully it helps you as we think about the passage, and to just go ahead and get into it. There are different views on what this passage is talking about, and some of the views, and I'll also say this. Uh, to look at this passage and for just a few minutes does I'm not trying to do a thorough, deep exegesis of the passage. That's not what I'm trying to do in these brief studies, frankly. What I'm really trying to do is to encourage all of us to just think about the matter, think about the passage, and perhaps think more deeply about it afterwards. Hopefully, to just jumpstart and hopefully to get us to meditate on the passage. But anyway, enough ranting. There are different views on this passage. One view of this passage, in thinking about and looking at the covering, one view is that it is speaking about a covering for all ages, namely that women today need to be wearing the same covering that they wore back then. That's just one of the views. A lot of folks, some folks have that view, a lot of folks perhaps, but that's one of the views of what this passage is talking about. Another view of this passage is that what is in view here are the spiritual gifts, as it talks about she who, and let me bump it up a little bit, as it's talking about praying and prophesying, there in verse 5. And to give a little bit of credence to that view, we are beginning in chapter 11, we are beginning a few chapters that have to do with the public assembly. The remainder of this week, we're going to be looking at the Lord's Supper, and then chapter 12, 13, and 14 pertain to the spiritual gifts. But one of the views is that this pertains to if you have a woman praying in the first century, because there were women, for example, Philip had 7 daughters who prophesied. And later on in 1 Corinthians, it's going to talk about praying in the Spirit. and that perhaps what is in view here are the spiritual gifts that were happening in the first century, and those spiritual gifts were not exclusive to men. Some of the women had them as well, and were perhaps praying and prophesying within the public assembly. So, and we may talk more about that as we go along. That's just one of the views. Another view of the passage is it's talking about the covering more from just the customs and traditions of the day, that there needed to be a respect for the customs and traditions of society. Another view still is that this whole thing is simply metaphorical. And remember how the chapter began. The head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Well, who is every man's head? Just said the head of man is Christ. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Okay, well, who is her head? Her head is man. Verse 3. So, one view is that verse 3 is the key to understanding the whole thing. That we are not talking about a physical covering at all, but we are speaking about something else. So anyway, you have those different views of this passage. There, that's real helpful. Now you're going to expect me to say which one I vote for. I'm probably not going to do that within this study, but I do want you to see what the problem is going on in Corinth. And I believe the problem is because he's hitting on matters of authority. So in thinking about the idea, right, verse 10, woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Later on in the account, it's going to talk about, and let me get over there in chapter 14, a little bit later on, chapter 14 at verse 34, let your women keep silent in the churches. That word silent, by the way, that's not the word for mute. It's the word for still, for they are not permitted to speak. They are to be submissive, as the law also says. This issue of submission, I would suggest, is the overall problem that he is addressing, starting to address, and is addressing here in chapter 11. It's a question of submission, and it's just a question of submission. The head of every man is Christ. Christ is submissive to God. The head of woman is man. The head of man is Christ. We are talking about matters of submission, and that is the problem that was happening in Corinth. It may be that, and I do believe, to look at what was happening, you had women who were casting off the authority that their husbands had. And why would they do that is the question. Well, I would suggest in the Old Testament, it was a very male-centric system. If it was not designed that way, at least it had grown that way. And then all of a sudden, the New Covenant, the New Testament comes on the scene. And you have the verse, there is neither slave nor free. There is neither circumcised nor uncircumcised. There is neither male nor female. Now we are all one in Christ. So I think that's one reason that perhaps you might have had, and I think the text bears it out, that women were casting aside the authority that perhaps their husbands had. I think another reason might also be the gifts. Like I already mentioned, the gifts were not exclusive to men. Women also had the gifts. So it may have empowered them to feel as though they could cast off the authority of their husbands. I would suggest that's the problem going on here that Paul is addressing. It's submission. So given that it's about submission and it's about subjection, we're still dealing with the same overall idea then that we've been dealing with for the past few chapters. because the past few chapters, chapter 8, 9, and 10, are all about liberties, and the whole point of liberties is that you serve one another, that you subject yourself to one another, that you submit to one another. That's the whole point of liberties. So what we see then is Paul has not changed subjects at all. He's talking about the same issue, and it just so happens the issue is manifesting itself in a different way. But the issue is still authority and submission and subjection. That's still the issue. It's about considering others. It's about considering others, and it's about fellowship. And you have this disruption to fellowship that was happening. Let's look back at the account. Look back at the verse. Let's see how it's all about fellowship. The head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, the head of Christ is God. So is that about subjection or is that about fellowship? The answer is yes. It's about both. And that's what we are talking about. Verse 8, for man is not from woman, but woman from man, nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. Verse 11, though, nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman comes from man, for as a woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are of God. It's about fellowship. It's about subjection. It's about submission. That's what it's about. It's about not being puffed up with pride. It's the same thread through this whole letter. Sometimes when folks read this passage, they get real focused in on the covering. And I think to understand what is being spoken about, we need to understand what the problem is. Because this was the problem. He's still dealing with the same issue. Disunity. That's the issue. So, what sort of things to look at the passage? To look at the passage. Do the customs of the day come into play? I think they do. And I personally, I'll go ahead and I guess I'll cast my vote. I personally think what is being spoken about perhaps is, and see, I'm even hedging there. I lean more towards that we're talking about the customs of the day. Look back at it. I want you to notice some of the conditionals. And for one thing, in thinking about, Paul starts off by speaking of the traditions, verse 2, just as I delivered them to you. But remember his traditions. To the Jew I became as a Jew, to the Gentiles he speaks about that earlier on. For though I am free from all men, I made myself a servant to all. To the Jews I became a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law. Those were Paul's traditions. But notice verse 6. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn. Well, what is going to determine whether or not it's shameful for a woman to be shorn? We may be speaking about the customs of the time. And those who have studied this issue a whole lot more than I have speak about the customs of the time. And the Corinthians needed to be thinking about the customs of the time. Look over in chapter 10. Chapter 10, and let's look down at the end of the chapter. Verse 32. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. This isn't just about what was happening in the church. This is about what's happening in society. They needed to be considering others. Liberties are not just about our brethren. Liberties are also about others. So, do customs come into play here? I believe they do. Could gifts also come into play? I also think that that may be the case because we are talking about praying and prophesying. And the praying may be praying in the Spirit. So that may also be the case. And I'm just looking at my notes, pardon me for not looking at you. Talking about roles as well. And just as Christ has his role, man has his role, and women have their role. And it's not that one is any better than the others. All is for the glory of God. But we subject ourselves. We subject ourselves to others. So, all those things come into play. Okay, now we'll say this, and if you have trouble with this, sorry in advance. If this is about the length of a person's hair, and just let me put it back up on screen, let me get over in the right chapter, and pardon me for this brief study being a little less brief than usual, but if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom. The contentiousness is not the custom. What he's saying is that this is not going to be any sort of church decree. That's not what this is. You are not going to make a decree about these things. We have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So, I've said that to say this. For those who think this is about the length of a person's hair, what you are going to have to do, and I don't mean this to be flippant, what you are going to have to do is you are going to have to find in Scripture, you are going to have to think about whether or not there's a Church of Christ haircut. That's what you're going to have to think about. If long hair is more holy on a woman and short hair is more holy on a man, so does that mean a bald man is the holiest? Is a bald man the holiest man there is? Does a woman ever have the right to get a haircut, or does she have to let it grow down to the floor and beyond? Is there such a thing as holy hair? Another issue that will come up for those who wear some sort of something on their head, for women who wear something on their head, some sort of physical covering, not hair. What you see happening a lot of times is they'll put it on when they're praying and they'll whip it off when they're not praying. They'll put it on at some point during the service and then they'll whip it off during the rest of the service. Is that what is going on here? It doesn't look like it from the context. This whole on, off, on, off. So does this mean I only have to have a symbol of authority on my head at certain points, and at other points I can take the symbol of authority off of my head? Oh, recognize authority, don't recognize the authority, recognize it, don't recognize it. That issue is going to have to be dealt with. Verse 6, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn, but if it is shameful, right? You have to think about that passage, and hopefully you recognize it, that it may be speaking about the customs of the day. But again, verse 16, this is not going to be a decree. The church, right? We have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. That's not what this is about, I don't believe. This is about authority. This is about subjection. This is about fellowship. And this is about not being puffed up. This is about the same thing we've been talking about for a while now. Hope the study's been helpful for you. Thanks for, again, sorry that it went on longer than usual. Folks write whole books about this. I'm amazed that I was able to talk about it in 20 minutes or less. Anyway, appreciate you joining us. Hope you have a good day. Hope you tune in tomorrow as well. Thanks for being here.